to hand things over to Aaron to get things started today.
Well, thanks so much, Katrina. Thanks so much, everyone, for joining us today as we talk a little bit about the science of talent attraction. And more specifically, I want to touch on understanding what makes people click. Again, my name's Aaron Schwartz, and as a strategist on the Employer Insights team at Indeed, I think I have probably one of the coolest jobs or most unique jobs. I get the opportunity to go out in the field or get on the line with clients, customers, really just people in the HR field that have the ever difficult job of filling these recs as the market really constricts and gets tougher. I also get the unique opportunity really to share some of Indeed's research, tips, tricks, data, strategies, and today we're going to do a little bit of all of that. But before we do begin, I do want to invite you. I get a little bit lonely over here on the line, so if you have any questions, concerns, thoughts, feedback, please feel free to email me personally. My email is aschwartz@indeed.com. And as Katrina said, we're all going to be on Twitter. I'm a Twitter geek myself, so if you have any thoughts, concerns, you want to allow me to join you in a conversation, please tweet me. The handle is @aschwartzy. And if you can please use the hashtag Indeed Insights, we'll be happy to get back to you as soon as the webinar is over. So with that, I think to properly tell the story, I think we need to begin at the very beginning. And that is by asking ourselves a question. And I don't think we should ask ourselves every day, but this is something we should constantly be thinking about is why do we recruit? Why do we do what we do? And I think it really falls into two main categories. The first is that recruiting changes millions of people's lives. If you think about the amount of people we've hired in the past year or years, or even the people we don't hire, we impact millions of people per year. But I think the main reason why we do what we do is because recruiting is the #1 source of business impact. Recruiting really affects what we're all here to do, is that bottom line and making money. And many people, famous people, have spoken to this. Steve Jobs from Apple famously said, "The secret of my success is that we've gone to exceptional lengths to hire the best people in the world." Kathy Engelbert from Deloitte said, "Our people are our greatest asset, and we're constantly trying to attract and retain high-quality talent." Tony Hsieh from Zappos, I think this is probably my favorite one, said, "The biggest category of mistakes we've made is in hiring. Over the past 11 years, bad hires cost the company well over $1 million." Steve Wynn from the Same Name Hotels, and I think this is something that really encapsulates all of these quotes and really starts to tell our stories. He said, "Human resources isn't a thing we do, it's the thing that runs our business." And for that reason, the responsibility of us, of talent leaders, of talent professionals, is immense. The pool is ever constricting. If we look back to 2009, only a couple years ago, during the Great Recession, there were 6.2 open positions for every, unemployed job seeker for every open position. So 6.2 people were looking for each job. Today, that's about 1.6 unemployed job seeker for every open position. So knowing what we know, how will we fill these positions in 2016? Really, all of us. And to answer that question, I want to talk about three things today. The first is we're going to talk about the sociology of job search. Second, I want to discuss the psychology of job search. And lastly, and I think most importantly, I want to leave you with 5 actionable takeaways and practices that we can use to help us really leverage this data and find great talent. So with that, I want to jump into part 1, the sociology of job search. And again, as Katrina mentioned earlier, please, unfortunately we can't take questions as we go because we're all on mute, but please type in your questions in the GoToWebinar box and we'll be happy to address those at the end. So in order to acquire the data that we're going to use for our conversation today, Indeed went out and conducted 2 comprehensive studies, really one of their kind, things that haven't been addressed first. So the first, we partnered with the Harris Poll, and we surveyed 6,500 unemployed and employed job seekers, which essentially means people. So we conducted a survey with 6,500 people, and on the flip side, we partnered with the polling company, and we surveyed 1,000 recruitment professionals, so essentially 1,000 of your peers. And when you take these two groups together, we really have the buyers and sellers of the recruitment marketplace. And the goal of our research was to test this widely held notion that we hear all the time, that 80% of candidates are passive and only 20% of candidates are active. Is this true, or is this some widely held belief? It shocks me that very little research has been done to even test if this notion that we hear every time we go to a conference, all the time in our recruitment marketplace, but is this true? Because if this is true, the way we go after a passive candidate is going to look far different than the way we go after an active candidate. We'd be spending a lot more time on the phone, emailing, and cold calling candidates. So we wanted to test this myth, and it turns out that 81% of people said that they actively look at job opportunities, when 58% of them said that they look at job opportunities at least monthly. Which means that this widely held notion that we hear all the time, that 80% of candidates are passive and only 20% are active, is actually backwards. It's actually the inverse. And it's when we look a little bit deeper into the data, it turns out the younger and more educated you are, the more likely you are to be looking at job opportunities. And since we're talking about people, and the vast majority of them are currently employed. And I think it's always interesting to kind of look at what people are looking for. But I think what's a better indication is, because people are actually employed and are actually looking, let's look at those hired in the past year. And we can use hired as a measure of quality, because I can make the argument that if they weren't quality, they probably wouldn't have been hired. But we look at those hired in the past year, virtually none of them were truly passive. Only 10% of those hired in the past 6 months said that they weren't actively looking for positions. But I think what's more, interesting to me here is these next three statistics. Because if you look at those making more than $100,000, it remains consistent. The college graduates remains consistent. And the most shocking is that those between the ages of 35 and 54, who largely represent our low-level directors or upper-level management, they too remained relatively consistent with these statistics. So we mentioned that people took some sort of action. So what was that action that they were taking towards finding a new position? And it turns out it falls into two main categories. The first is visiting some sort of online job site or job board, and the second is asking for a family or professional referral, with job search largely being the number one activity. Now, we hear all the time that candidates come to us via mobile, and that candidates are using their mobile devices to apply to positions. At Indeed, 54% of all of our traffic comes from a mobile device. But what was interesting to me about this part of the study is that, we know that candidates come to us via mobile, but what was interesting is that candidates expect us to come to them via mobile as well. And that can be, different ways for different types of people, but one way was through a job alert. So a job alert can be different for different companies, but for us at Indeed, a job alert is when a candidate comes on Indeed and they type a what and a where. So if you're familiar with our site, we have a what box and a where box. You could type in a skill, a company, a position, all types of things in the what box, and a where would be a location, and they can save that alert. So it could be software engineers in Austin, it could be teachers in San Francisco, whatever it may be. And every time a new job is updated with that search, this candidate gets an alert. But what's interesting about these alerts is that we notice two things. The first is that candidates are a lot smarter than we thought. And they rarely, or shouldn't at least, be using their corporate issued emails when they're looking for new positions. So they'll often use their personal emails. And the number one place we check those personal emails when we're sitting at our desk and we get an email from a job site, we pull out our mobile devices. So we found that most candidates are looking at these alerts on their mobile devices. The second thing we found, and this might be probably the most interesting part of this research, was that candidates rarely turn these alerts off. And that's where we found the most shocking part of our research, is that being hired rarely changes someone's job search behavior. And that 65% of all candidates who are hired are back on Indeed, the world's #1 job site, within 91 days of being hired. And 50% of those making between 100 and 110,000 are back on Indeed within 28 days of being hired, which is largely still during our onboarding process. Now, I know this looks, freaky to all of us, but I think this represents really the new age of consumer behavior. Who on the line has bought a car in the last 6 months to a year? You know that after you bought that car, you find yourself back on cars.com or whatever it may be, just making sure that you made the right decision. And we see that too with job seekers. So that's the sociology of job search. So again, to quickly recap, truly passive candidates are a lot rarer than you think. The younger and more educated you are, the more likely you are to be actively looking. Online job search is the #1 activity for those who are hired. And again, I think hired is a great metric for quality, because those who are quality should probably get hired. And lastly, the job search is always on, and most new hires look for jobs, again, within 91 days. So with that, I want to jump into part 2, the psychology of job search. Now, the psychology of job search really focuses around the decision-making process, and more specifically, the career decision-making process. And that is that a candidate must make at least 7 major decisions before they can become an employee with your company. And here are those 7 decisions. And I'm going to give you a second to process it, and then we're going to go through it. So the career decision-making process is 7 distinct decisions. So the first decision a candidate must make is they must consider a change. Second, they need to consider your company for a change. Third, they need to consider a position at your company. And ultimately, the 4th step is they need to apply. The 5th step they need to take is they need to commit to the process. So whether that be taking a day off from their current position or submitting to a drug screening or background check, whatever it may be. The 6th decision is they need to accept the offer. And 7th, they need to ultimately show up on day 1. And I'm sure there's some giggles on the line, but we all know how difficult that is to actually get a candidate from step 6 to decision number 7. And we've all had those difficulties getting them to ultimately show up on day 1. Now, the first decision, considering a change, not surprising, it's by far the hardest. We don't like change. Change is new. So within that step, we've made some research observations. So the first research observation we made was that career decisions are amongst the most stressful life decisions. And after only family and health, career events have the biggest impact on our stress and happiness. And to provide a little bit of research, I bring to you the Holmes and Ray stress scale. And again, I'll give you a second to just take a look. But what's interesting to me here is that career-related events really span the whole scale. So as we can see on top, the career-related events, and on the bottom, we have life-related events. And a 20, change in working hours or conditions, is on the same stress level as a change in residence. A 36, a change to a different line of work, is only a little bit less stressful than a pregnancy. And that's what I think I found super interesting, is that when we look at these career changes, they really span the entire scale of stress-related events, and only after family and health they have the biggest impact. The second observation I want to leave you with is that most people are wired to be resistant to career change. Again, not shocking. We don't like change. It's difficult. It's new. And more importantly, career change requires us to project the future, and think about what we're gaining against what we're losing, imagining potential benefits against potential risks. And it turns out, research shows that we're not very good at predicting the future. If we were in the business of predicting the future, I think we'd all be doing a lot different, we'd all have a lot different positions today. But it turns out when it comes to predicting of career change, we overestimate the probability of failure while underestimating the potential benefits of that change. And I think this quote from the career psychologist really kind of sums it up. He says, when weighing up the costs and benefits of a decision, we make two errors. First, we overestimate the probability of failure in a new direction because of our negative bias. Second, we underestimate the benefits of change because we fail to imagine or visualize the results of that change in much detail. Now, I'm sure we're all familiar with Mr. Maslow, who is the famous psychologist who famously created the hierarchy of needs that said our brains are wired for survival and not fulfillment. And the career psychologist was quoted on Maslow basically saying that when our brains are involved, we predict the worst and try to eliminate risk. That's why our cognitive functions and emotion evolved too. We're 3 to 5 times more sensitive to negative stimuli than positive. So that's research observation number 2. Research observation number 3 is that career changes are major life changes, and again, change takes a lot of work. So when we kind of put all these together, the forces against career change are incredibly strong. Again, we're underestimating the potential benefits because of, as the career psychologists say, because of we focus on the negative stimuli. We're overestimating the chance of failure. It's high stress, and only after family and health is it the third highest stress. And again, making a career change is hard work. But then you're going to ask me, hold on a second, Aaron. People change all the time. People buy new houses, people buy new cars, people move cities, and ultimately, people find new opportunities and new jobs. So what is it that leads employed people to change? What is it that leads people to find new jobs? And we can see the data on the left, but it turns out it's two things. One, they're either inspired by a new opportunity, position, or company, or two, we change when we're disillusioned with our current work. Now, to kind of even this out, we went back to our poll with the polling company with our talent professionals, and we wanted to even it out. So we asked our talent professionals, and we asked them, all things equal, do you prefer active or passive candidates? Now, it's not surprising to me that 9 out of 10 talent professionals said that they prefer an active candidate. This kind of makes sense, but what's super interesting to me here is that when we look at the data, it's an exact tie for whether these talent professionals prefer active candidates that are employed or active candidates that are unemployed. There's no preference there as long as they are active. And it's not surprising because active candidates have already done most of the psychological legwork. They've already done most of the work to cross that psychological chasm. And we go back to the career decision-making process. An active candidate has already considered a change. They've considered your company for a change. They've considered a position at your company, and they've ultimately applied, which means our job as recruitment professionals is to get these candidates to go through steps 5 to 7. So committing to the process, accepting an offer, and ultimately, again, that ever difficult process of getting them to show up on day 1. And when we talk about what attracts candidates, it turns out that most candidates consider opportunities based on pay, location, and flexibility. And when we look at further into the data, to when people are changing positions, what's attracting them, we could see at the top are some of these good pay, location, flexible hours, benefits. And at the bottom, we see some of these company mission, clear path for advancement, which is further proving out Maslow, who, remember, said that we're wired for survival over fulfillment. And we see a lot of these survival things at the top, and fulfillment responses are towards the bottom. But there are people who do choose meaningful work. And when we ask that question to our respondents, to our job seekers, I think it's super interesting here is that we kind of this U-shaped curve when we look at the demographics of those who choose meaningful work. You know, those between the ages of 18 and 34 may not have financial burdens or kids at home, and they can choose some meaningful work. While on the flip side, those who are older, kids may be out of the house, their financial burdens may be paid off, and they too have the opportunity to choose meaningful work. And as it turns out, the more educated you are, the more likely you are to choose some of this meaningful work. And that leads directly into our research observation number 4. And that is that people feel better about decisions that they fully control. So to further, I guess, prove this point, we asked candidates, when deciding whether or not to accept an offer, is it important that you've looked at other opportunities first? And 83% of them said that they agree or strongly agree. And then we asked if they felt that they'd be more successful if they found the job on their own, and 52% of employed adults agreed. Now, to put that into some real-world perspective, let's think of a scenario where you're looking to buy a new car. And you know you want a Toyota Camry, for example. So you go to one dealership and you look at the Camrys they have on the lot. Then you go to a second dealership and you look at their Camrys. And you go to a third dealership and you get to see that Camry. And then you get a price from each one and you compare the specs and the prices. And you ultimately drive off with the Camry that you were looking for. You're going to feel great about that decision. Now think of a scenario where you're driving down the road and you hear put, 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 and you have to pull into the first dealership you find because your car is dead and you need a new car and you have to buy the only car on the lot. You're going to feel a lot better about the decision where you're able to look around first and the one that you found on your own versus someone else finding it for you. And candidates are the same way. They're going to feel a lot better about a position when they can look at other positions first, and they're also going to feel better when it was a job that they found on their own. And the last piece of data I want to share in the psychology is that the candidates that were asked if a recruiter or friend proactively contacted them, would they look at other positions? And 78% of them said yes. And this tells me that even the most passive candidates who aren't looking, when somebody contacts them and asks them, hey, are you interested? They're going to start looking at other positions. So even the most passive candidates are very easily turned active. So again, that's the psychology of job search. So to quickly highlight, career change involves stressful multi-step psychological process. So again, this is that 7-step decision-making process that we went through. Passive candidates only have to go, passive candidates need to go through all 7, so they have 7 barriers to change, while active candidates are only, again, those 5 to 7, so the committing to the process, accepting an offer, and showing up on day 1. And lastly, candidates prefer to be in control, and they want to find their best fit. So with that, I want to jump into part 3. And this is really where I can leave you with some actionable takeaways, and we could talk about how do we leverage everything we just heard. So the first thing we really need to think about is that there's never been more ways to recruit talent. Today we have professional profiles and talent marketplaces and job sites, job search engines, referrals. There's so many ways to recruit talent. But I think the way we need to start looking at it, instead of this active passive conversation, is that all of these new places, all of these new ways to recruit talent fall into two basic approaches. And this is the new conversation that we need to be having. They all fall into either inbound candidates or outbound candidates. So again, an inbound candidate is a candidate that raises their hand and says, I want a job, and they send, they apply to you or they come to you. While an outbound candidate is one that you go out and proactively recruit, or the first touch point is from you, the talent professional, and could be through different platforms. Through us specifically, it would be through our resume database. Now, when we asked, again, we touched on this earlier, but when we asked the talent professionals, most talent professionals are going to try to fill open positions with inbound candidates. 9 out of 10 said that they prefer active and inbound candidates because, it's pretty obvious. It's easier, cheaper, and faster, the definition of innovation. And most importantly, it's more likely to result in a success. Now, at Indeed, we're pretty lucky to be able to access a lot of these companies that we work with. They'll access their data. And when we really dove into the data and looked at it, it turns out that companies that fully measure their cost per hire are going to find additional reasons why outbound recruiting is going to be far more expensive. It's labor intensive. It takes a long time. Often, low offer acceptance rates. People aren't necessarily ready to change. Uncertain cultural fit. People, again, we don't like change. We don't want to learn a new position. We don't want to make new friends. We don't want to have a new boss. And as we go back to that 7-step decision, that could be extremely time consuming. That could take a really long time. Now, I think it's kind of a sidebar, but I always found this super interesting, is that when we compare those inbound versus outbound candidates, those who are outbound are going to have a little bit of a higher expectation when it comes to salary increases than those who are inbound and active candidates. And when I think about this on a real world basis, I think about my friends who are, we should say, active friends versus passive friends. When you call your active friend, you say, hey man, let's go out, let's go grab a drink or grab some food. They say, sure, they're ready to go. And when you call an outbound friend or a passive friend, they say, I don't know. And then you have to say, well, I'll buy your drinks, I'll pay for your dinner, I'll pay for your movie. And it's the same way with candidates. The inbound ones are going to expect a lot less of a salary increase. They're going to expect a lot less from you than an outbound candidate. But as we talk about the difficulties of outbound recruiting, I think we'd be remiss if we didn't touch on the fact that inbound recruiting has some challenges as well. Some roles by nature just get way too many applications to screen. Some roles, again, by nature are just harder to quickly fill. Today, in an environment where a lot of the times, the gone is the day where you printed out your resume and have to fax it to somebody, it's difficult to control who applies. With one button, you can apply to many positions. Some open roles need to be kept confidential. Aaron's getting fired next week. How do we backfill his position without him knowing? And I think this has always been a universal problem, but resumes don't really provide enough data. Resumes don't tell the whole story. So that brings us, I guess, to the million-dollar question. How can you shape your recruiting organization to really take advantage of this changing nature of job search? So to that note, I'm going to leave you with 5 practices that we've seen the best-in-class organizations really utilize to take advantage of this changing nature, and they go out and find the right talent. The first takeaway I want to leave you with is to sequence your recruiting tactics to maximize for quality, cost, and performance. So what does that mean? That means the first thing you're going to want to do is take advantage of all your free inbound methods. Only after you've exhausted that traffic, then you want to move on to your paid inbound tactics. So whether that's sponsoring jobs or whether that's paying for placements, whatever it may be. And then lastly, when you've exhausted those two, move to your outbound traffic. Now, again, to put this into a little bit of a real world scenario, think about if you own a restaurant and you have a long line of people waiting at the door, and you open up the door and you push all them aside and you say, hey, let me go find hungry people. That's essentially what we're doing if we flip this around. First, let all those hungry people in line come in, vet them, use that free traffic, use the people who are in line waiting for you, and only after you've exhausted all that, then move on to your outbound tactics. If we look at this heat map, and when we talk about sequencing, it's not just sequencing all your tactics and only first focusing on inbound. It's going to go by region and position as well. Unfortunately, if you're in Indiana, positions there will remain chronically unfilled longer than positions in any other state. So sequence your outbound efforts to Indiana while allowing a lot of the inbound stuff to come from states like Alaska or Colorado, or whatever it may be, that do a little bit better. And it's also going to be by position as well. Here we kind of have our top 10 list of jobs that we've seen through our data that were some of the hardest ones to fill. So if you have positions like this, these are some of the ones you want to sequence your outbound efforts on filling these positions while allowing some of the easier ones through inbound. So again, that's the first takeaway, is to sequence your recruiting efforts. So focusing on the free inbound, then the paid inbound, and then moving on to outbound. The second takeaway I want to leave you with, and I think personally this is probably the most important one, and that is to shape your candidate pipeline. We talk about this era of search, and we talk about these search algorithms. So what does that really mean? And to be completely candid, at Indeed, we have hundreds of engineers who are constantly working on our algorithm to really find the most relevant content for our job seekers. Now, that algorithm is constantly changing every second, and it's way above my pay grade, and it's not something I can control, and it's not something you can control. But what you can control is your own content. Now, if I were to ask everyone on the line today, what are the 3 most important things we need to know when dealing with real estate? I think we'd all immediately, our hands would pop up and we'd say location, location, location. Now, if I were to ask you the 3 most important things we need to know with job content, the 3 are quality, quality, and quality. A quality title, a quality description, and a quality process. Because again, in an era of search, people are finding our jobs on search engines. So a quality title is going to have them click on that position and ultimately lead to your description. And that quality description is ultimately going to lead them to your quality apply process, and that's where you're going to make that next great hire. So I wanted to focus the next couple of minutes really on those 3 qualities and how we can optimize them to really make some great hires. So the first, I want to focus on that first quality, your quality title. Now, before we jump into this, I want to introduce a concept called A/B testing. For those who are unfamiliar with an A/B test is when you take a control group and you give half the group A and you give half the group B, and you can test performance. So for example, if we cut everyone on the line today in half, and we took half the group and we gave them a fresh, piping hot brewed cup of coffee with caffeine, and then we gave the other group, Group B, the same exact cup of coffee, but without caffeine. And we measured performance, and in this situation, we probably just see who falls asleep quicker. But we can do that with everyday decisions, and especially our job content. As a side note, I was giving this presentation a couple weeks ago to a group, and somebody raised their hand and they said to me, well, I don't A/B test because I'm not an engineer. So, well, it's an engineering concept, but it's interesting that you brought that up, because how'd you get to work today? And the man said to me, well, I drove. I said, well, which way did you drive? He said, the shorter one. I said, how'd you know it was shorter? He said, I tried the other one. I said, that right there is an A-B test. You drove to work A and you drove to work B, and you used the one that performed better, the one that was quicker. And we could do that with our everyday job content. So for example, we had a company approach us, and they had this position called a Marketing Coordinator 3. Now, does anybody know what a Marketing Coordinator 3 is? I mean, I'm sure we can guess it's some sort of marketing position related to a certain level of seniority or a certain pay band, but it doesn't really tell the story. So it's not surprising that when we honed the position down to what it really was, which is a marketing events coordinator, that the same position in the same city with the same salary performed 10 times better. So I think the first thing we can think about when we think about our title, and I always say this, is think about your title as a pickup line. This is really your candidate's first engagement with your content, with you. You want to have a strong pickup line that tells a story that engages a candidate and draws them in order to get to your next quality, which is your quality description. Now, when it comes to quality descriptions, I think it's important that we write job descriptions that draw in talent and perform well in search. So do those two things, draw talent and perform well in search. And I love this posting from Spotify because I think it really tells the story. So I'm going to read it to you out loud, and then we're going to dive a little bit deeper into it. It says, we're looking for thoughtful, well-rounded front-end engineers to join our team. If you're the right one for us, you love the web, take great pride in your work, think of coding as more than just a job, and have a few great projects to show off. You can take a concept and transform it into an awesome web-based experience with your own technical and UI UX expertise. Now, the reason I love this description is because I think it was written to do those two things. If we look at the words in the blue, they were written to draw talent. Thoughtful, well-rounded, you love the web, take great pride, more than a job, take concept and transform it. These are really some words that pull in candidates. They draw talent. And on the same note, they have words that are there to perform well in search and on search engines like Indeed. Front-end engineers, team, web, coding, projects, concept, technical, UI, UX expertise. And that's why I love this description so much. Now, again, I was giving we're having this conversation with actually two different companies. One was a government agency and one was a healthcare company, and they both said to me the same thing, which I found super interesting. They both said, well, hold on, Aaron. We're a hospital. We can't say that we're looking for, X political operatives or thoughtful. We can't do some of these more specific things. And I said, well, it's going to be different for all industries, but every industry has a way to draw in talent, to show a little bit of emotion, to have a human touch to their positions. As an example that I told them is we had a healthcare company out in California, and they're hiring for fusion therapists. So they wrote out the word fusion and they wrote out the word therapy going vertically, and each letter from fusion represented a requirement from the candidate, and each letter from therapy represented a requirement of the position. And by doing just that, they're able to see a boost in performance because it showed a little bit of a human touch. Now, the other great thing is we talk about really diving into our data and really A/B testing. We can use the metrics to improve our content. So I'm going to share with you one piece of data that we have that can go a long way into getting more applies, and that is that job descriptions between 700 and 2,000 characters, and this is from Indeed's internal data, is that we've seen that they get 30% more applies. And this doesn't mean if you have a description with 4,000 characters to go chop it in half. This doesn't mean if you have a description with 200 characters to just add a whole bunch of extra nonsense. This means that you have this range to really tell a story, to really dive into what the position actually is. When we think about with our titles and descriptions, it's important that we don't use acronyms or internal terms that are only relevant to those currently at our company. I saw recently two titles that I thought were pretty interesting. One was for an awesome people person. instead of Director of Human Development or Director of Human Resources, I think. Again, cutesy and acronyms aren't going to be the way people are going to find positions on a search engine. We've also seen a huge uptick within the descriptions and titles of ninja jobs and guru jobs. And I don't know where this trend started, but I've always joked that there's some ninja island with a 0% unemployment rate. But again, really hone into what you're actually looking for and put that within the description. Think of words that are the actual requirements. So instead of maybe computer savvy, I have a 4-year-old nephew who can play with an iPad, but I don't think that's the computer savvy we're looking for. So think about putting things like Adobe skills required or looking for someone proficient in Microsoft Excel. The other thing I want to note when we look at descriptions is I was at a conference the other week, and the woman who was speaking, she said that far too often we have a long list of the requirements, and then we have a few benefits at the bottom. When you think about a requirement of a position, it's what do I need from you? What do you have to have before you can get an interview with me? What do you have to have before you can get this position? Well, a benefit is what am I going to give you? What's in it for you? And they said that she said that her goal was her laundry list of requirements should be shorter than your laundry list of benefits. I'm going to give you way more than I'm going to require from you to even get in the room and have an interview with me. And on that note, when we think about benefits, those should be things we're adding into our description. I don't know a candidate in the world who doesn't want more PTO or 401k or health benefits. And if you have those should 100% be in the description, as we talk about adding more relevant stuff. Another key piece of data that we found internally is that the two fastest growing terms on Indeed are remote and flexible. If you have the capability to have flexible arrangements for your employees, you 100% should be putting that in the description, because the quality description is going to lead your candidate to hit the apply button and ultimately end up at your quality apply process. Well, before we jump completely into there, I want to just mention that we talked about this mobile piece and this part, that mobile has become really an integral part of the process. And I mentioned earlier that 54% of all of our traffic on Indeed comes from a mobile device, but what I think is a better indication is that 24% of all of our traffic only comes from a mobile device. Now, at Indeed, we actually just announced last week that we had over 200 million unique visitors per month, which means that if you're not being able to be viewed or applied to from a mobile device, you're missing out on 24% of 200 million people. That's essentially 50 million people can't access your jobs. And that's really where this apply process comes in. A quality process is not just whether you can be applied to or from a mobile device. It also, think about a block text on a mobile device. It's difficult to read. It's a lot of scrolling. So it's important that we optimize for mobile in order to get candidates to our apply process. And when we think about our apply process, it's important that we don't lose good candidates to overly complex processes. Now we can see the data in front of us that after just 30 screener questions, 50% of all candidates who start the process won't finish the process. And one way I really reiterate this when I'm doing this presentation live is I'll usually reach out to someone in front of me in the first row and I'll ask them what their name is. And they'll say John or Mark. And I'll say, well, Mark, where are you from? And as they're answering that question, I'll start to barrage them with questions. Where'd you buy your shoes? What size shoe are you? What color are your socks? Where'd you get your shirt? And they give me this look like, Aaron, what are you doing? And I said, that can get pretty annoying, right? Barraging someone with questions. Then why do we do that to our candidates? We've already talked about how difficult it is in this environment to get a candidate to click on our title. And when they get to our description, to finally hit the apply button, and when they hit that apply button, they're barraged with a ton of screener questions. Now, I know you're thinking, well, hold on, Aaron. The point of screener questions is to vet out some of those low-quality candidates. But I think we're also vetting out some of those quality candidates. And I'm not saying the answer is 0 screener questions, and the answer is, and I'm not saying it's I don't know. I don't know what the answer is. But maybe one solution, let's put people back in the process. People are far more likely to answer a question on the phone in a phone screener than they are to fill out a box on a typed in screener question. Maybe this is something that, again, falls into that thing where we can A/B test. Because a quality process is not where we want to lose our great candidates and ultimately make those hires. So again, focusing on that quality title, which leads to your quality description, and your quality process is really a great way that you can shape your candidate pipeline, and that's my second takeaway for you. The third takeaway I want to leave you with is to build a brand that brings talent to you. When we think about, before you probably go eat at a restaurant, you're probably going to check Yelp for reviews, and before you watch a movie, you'll probably ask a friend or check Rotten Tomatoes to see if it's a good movie, and before you apply to or accept an offer, a candidate is going to check their company reviews. And 83% of candidates say that reviews impact where they ultimately apply. And 46% of those candidates, more importantly, said that even after they applied and received an offer, the company reputation matters on whether they're going to accept that offer. And I think what's interesting is, from Indeed's internal data, is that we've seen that companies with reviews, good or bad I should add, see a 5% increase in applies. So that's the third takeaway, is to really optimize your brand, and really build a brand that's going to bring talent to you. The fourth takeaway I want to leave you with is to optimize both the inbound and outbound candidate experience for top talent. So what does that mean? What it means to me is that your inbound process needs to be good enough that you can encourage candidates to go through it. Which means that if you meet somebody at a networking party, or you meet somebody in a parking lot even, and you think they're a great candidate, you should feel confident enough with your process to say, hey, yeah, go online, apply to the process, and you'll enjoy it, and you'll really it'll be a great experience, as opposed to going, calling them on their phones and kind of circumventing the process, which we all do now. And Airbnb is a great example of this because they realized that their candidate experience needed an overhaul. So what did they do? They mapped their entire process end to end, and they created a storyboarding exercise. And they asked themselves 4 questions. It says, what do we want the candidates to know? What do we want them to feel? What does rejection look like at each stage? And what makes this stage uniquely Airbnb? And what they implemented was an FAQ section for candidates. They initiated a candidate feedback survey, not just for those hired, but those rejected as well. What are they saying to their friends? What are they saying to other people? Do they feel like they were fairly evaluated? And lastly, they implemented interviewer training for all their interviewers to know what their step in the process was. What was the point of their actual stage in the process, and what made their stage uniquely Airbnb? So that's the fourth takeaway, is to optimize for both inbound and outbound candidates. The fifth and last takeaway, and this one's a little bit nuanced, but you want to build a platform for inbound recruiting. And I think about it this way. If outbound recruiting is akin to sales, inbound recruiting is going to look much more like marketing. And that's why our recruiting technologies are going to evolve to look more like marketing technologies. We have these two stacks side by side, and we can see that a career site's similar to a landing page, and apply is like a lead. Screening is similar to predictive scoring. Your candidate marketing automation is going to be similar to marketing automation. Your candidate CRM is going to be like your CRM. And it's interesting, I was at a conference and the speaker said, if you don't engage your candidates in your CRM, then all you have is a list. And I thought that was super interesting. And the last is that your talent's performance analytics are going to look like your performance analytics. And one great example of this is BE Aerospace, which is a company that really outfits the plane. So Boeing builds a plane and BE Aerospace outfits the planes. And what they did was they appended their employment records to not know just where the best sources of hire are coming from, but in 2 years they can look at an employee record and see where their best candidates are coming from as well. So those are the 5 takeaways. Again, sequence your recruiting tactics, shape your candidate pipeline, build a brand that brings talent to you. The 4th is to optimize the candidate experience, and lastly, build an inbound recruiting platform. So just wanted to run through what we've seen from some of these companies. What are they seeing? An 87% reduction in cost per hire, half the applicants required to fill a position, targeted candidates are going to be 8 times more likely to apply, and faster times to hire. Now I want to leave you with one quick bonus tip, and that is to assume the role of the job seeker. When I was last in the job marketplace, I took my resume to a recruiter, and she took a look at my resume. She told me to switch candidate experience and my education. I took it to a second recruiter, and they told me the exact opposite. And it was frustrating. So I took my resume, I went down the street, and I went into the first business I found, and it was a law firm. And I asked the woman there, I said, "Are you the hiring manager?" And she said, "Yeah, are you a lawyer?" I said, "Absolutely not, but will you take 30 seconds to look at my resume?" And that was the best advice I got. And that's what you should do. If you're in the marketing department, take your resume to the engineering department and see if your titles make sense. If your process is too long, go through the process. Is really just assume the role of the job seeker.